do think of Martin Luther King, right, we think of him here in August of 1963 at the March on Washington, giving his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And that makes sense. That makes sense in a lot of ways. You know, it's a powerful, moving statement about American democracy. It was cast both, it moved the 250,000 people who were there, as well as the massive television audience. It expressed ideals of racial brotherhood. It was cast in the ideas of American democracy. And it's very poetic and emotional, particularly in the last section where he talks about his dream. And yet, if we focus just on this one moment of the dream speech, we might miss as much as we catch. We might miss, for instance, the larger context of the civil rights movement, the larger context in which Dr. King was operating. In the speech and in his life and in his career, he's not just weaving Black people into the fabric of American democracy, he's also in many ways challenging American ideals. In a lot of ways, he's kind of a radical critic of American practices. You know, as a nation, in some ways, we've sanitized Martin Luther King. In the words of one of my colleagues, we've turned him into a Black Santa Claus as a universally acceptable figure. This guy who always turns the other cheek, always tells us that we are good, that he just has this dream. A closer look at Martin Luther King's speeches, I think, especially when we frame it in the context of the larger Black freedom movement, can reveal a much more complex picture. We can see Martin Luther King as a moral force, but we can also see him as in many ways as sort of a nuts and bolts practical leader on some levels too. We can see him as a representative of his people and African Americans, but we can also see him as guided by the imperatives of his individual conscience, stemming from his background and his ideals. We can see Martin Luther King as the quintessential American, but also as a radical dissenter from the American tradition in a lot of ways. So as we dive into the speeches, I've tried to provide just some guiding questions, some things that you might want to have in the back of your mind as we go through these speeches. And we'll revisit in a different form these questions by the end. But to think about, for instance, what are King's strategies as an orator, and what are his particular talents? What is he good at doing? What are his priorities? What are his messages? Who does he go to for authority? You know, how does he make his arguments, in other words? Like any historian, when we're reading documents, we want to be conscious not just of the person producing the document, but the agenda that they're putting forth and the audience to which they're putting it forth. So how is King tailoring his message based on the audience that he's speaking to? It's a question worth asking. And then what does that mean in terms of, and how is he casting his message, particularly in the rapidly shifting context of the civil rights movement in the King years from the mid-1950s to the late 1960s? And these are the kinds of messages that we want to make sure that our students understand in particular, to think about historical documents in particular contexts. We might also understand Martin Luther King as not a static figure, but someone who evolves over the course of his lifetime. And to think about both the continuities in King's values, but also the changes in his message over time. And finally, just a sort of an interesting sort of thought-provoking question, one we can revisit at the end. How should we think about Martin Luther King in the American political tradition? As a liberal, as someone who advocates reform within the American tradition, or as a radical, someone who seeks to overturn the existing system to achieve a genuine democracy? And there is no easy answer to that question, but I think it's one worth grappling with as we go forward. So let's start with a little bit about background on King himself, right? How does King become who he is? And particularly thinking about his oratorical tradition. One thing that's really key to think about is that King's larger historical experience, his larger personal experience, is rooted in the traditions of the African-American church. He is a member, as you probably know, of the Black elite in Atlanta. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., or Daddy King, was a famed preacher at Ebenezer Baptist Church. King would later take over that same pulpit. In that pulpit now is the Senator Raphael Warnock. So from a young age, he was at ease in the pulpit. He was constantly compelled to express the abstract ideas of theology, but in compelling terms that could reach a big audience. He was schooled from an early age in the expressive use of his language, and as we see, his language itself is so powerful. And he scaled at fusing both intellect, ideas, with emotion or feelings, as any powerful speech must. He used the techniques of the Black pulpit, repetition, stating the same phrase over again to achieve power. Call and response with his audience, right? The Black pulpit in particular depends upon the give and take between the speaker and the audience. Sort of a musicality in terms of his speech, a physicality in terms of his presentation. These are all aspects of King's oratorical tradition. And the larger tradition in the Black pulpit, of course, is to challenge the dominant ideals, given the African-American historical experience dating back to slavery, right? To express faith is in many ways to challenge the dominant order that keeps you down, to look for a kind of freedom. And so that's within the tradition of the Black church. Of course, King also has an intellectual tradition that stretches beyond simply the Black church, and that's schooled by his experience at Morehouse College, and then Crozer Theological Seminary, and then getting his PhD at Boston University. We might look at a couple key intellectual influences along his path in that regard. One worth considering, a thinker who had an enormous influence on King, particularly in the early years of his development of his intellect, was Walter Rauschenbusch, who was an activist and a theologian of the early 20th century, particularly he's associated with the progressive era, and the idea of the social gospel, the idea that we can create a more perfect kingdom of God here on earth. In other words, it was an impetus for reform. And Rauschenbusch has an essentially optimistic view of man's nature, of human nature. The idea that people are inherently good and that we can continue to push for reforms, and it's sort of a classically liberal idea in that sense. And King was, especially in his early years, was quite taken by this, the idea that through reform we can bring about God's kingdom. Yet over time, King also developed a more sort of pessimistic view of human nature. And in this, he was particularly influenced by the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who had a strong influence on a lot of liberal and radical thinkers of the 20th century. Niebuhr really emphasizes the complexity of man's existence, the persistence of sin within man, that man is inherently sinful and must try to constantly overcome that. And Niebuhr was also a critic of capitalism. He said that it was inherently exploitative, that it created disparities. And thus, Niebuhr had a strong emphasis on the need for power, that the only way to change the existing order was to force the existing order to change, right? And King, in his typical tradition, was believed in sort of the dialectic of fusing two ideas together and finding a common ground. So throughout his oratory, as we'll see, throughout his political career in general, he embodies both the optimistic message of Rauschenbusch and the emphasis on sort of the practical ideals of compelling change that we associate with Reinhold Niebuhr. And this particularly played out in his guiding doctrine of nonviolence, or what we call nonviolent direct action, right? The idea is that nonviolent protest is not something that is passive, but rather that is something that is aggressive. It takes discipline, it takes training, and it attacks a social problem. That's what nonviolence does. It is aggressive in that sense. And how does it work? Well, by being nonviolent in the face of oppression, you achieve a higher moral ground, right? And by doing that, you express your larger discontent with the existing conditions. And what you do is you're also sending a message, right? You're attracting a broader audience. You're attracting the liberals who might help gain support for your cause. And even in its most optimistic frame, even you'll convert your oppressors, although King tends to drift away from that idea as his career goes on. So I just want to start by sort of giving you some of these intellectual influences that shape King in those early years. I gave you 5 speeches to consider. And these obviously aren't the only speeches of Martin Luther King. I picked them out of this book that I have. I have Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream, Writings and Speeches That Changed the World. And they're all available on the internet. I gave you those links. And I started with his first speech that really, where he first emerged as a public figure. And that was in 1955 at the very beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott here at Holt Street Baptist Church. This photo is actually from the end of the boycott, but it's at the same church. In 1955, he's 26 years old, really young age. And that's something that maybe your students can connect to in certain ways. He's recently arrived as the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, still finishing his PhD. At that point, Dexter Avenue has a sort of a small congregation of professionals, some faculty at the local college, Alabama State. And at the beginning, there are very few political messages in his sermons, but over time, he starts to develop more of them, particularly as he's confronted with the harshness of segregation in Montgomery. And then in the fall of 1955, there's the decision to launch the bus boycott after the arrest of Rosa Parks, who's an NAACP secretary, has been trained at the Highlander Folk School, is a seamstress, and she, of course, as everybody knows, refuses to give up her seat on the bus. E.D. Nixon, who's the head of the local NAACP, sees an opportunity to use Parks as a launching symbol for this larger boycott. There's a group called the Women's Political Council as well that sort of is the grassroots group that distributes all the leaflets that gets this enormous crowd. to Holt Street Baptist Church for King's speech. And King is elected as the leader of this new group, the MIA, the Montgomery Improvement Association, which is this coalition of ministers, essentially. And the only reason really that they put King in that role is because the others have these long-standing rivalries, and King is a relative neutral. But he almost immediately through the speech, vaults in terms of his standing in Montgomery and ultimately in the nation and the world. At the beginning of the speech, there's still some question about whether there's going to be a boycott at all. So he's giving the speech with the idea of rousing the Black community. So thinking about audience, right? This is a message directed specifically to the African-American audience in Montgomery in 1955, with the idea of steeling them for a bus boycott, which originally is going to last 1 day, then 3 days, and ultimately ends up lasting over a year. Some of the key themes in this speech, this first mass meeting. One is how he talks about the ideas of democracy and race in Montgomery itself. He asked the specific question of what is your day-to-day existence as a second-class citizen in Montgomery, right? Segregation, in other words, it keeps them down. He highlights the role of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks can serve in many ways as a symbol of the larger community. She's not the first person who's been arrested for refusing to give her a seat on the bus, but she is this galvanizing figure who connects to both the working class and the middle class within Black Montgomery, and King highlights her as this key symbol through which a movement can coalesce. And here again, he speaks about nonviolence as an active, confrontational idea. He says, look, we're not violent. We have never done that. That's a quote from him. But he contrasts the Black citizens of Montgomery with white violence, with the Ku Klux Klan, with the Citizens Council, which these organized groups designed to enforce segregation. In other words, he's insisting to Black Montgomery that we are on a higher moral plane, right? The work of nonviolence. But at the same time, he's calling protest a weapon, right? He's, again, nonviolence is not passive, nonviolence is aggressive. Nonviolence forces confrontation in that way. And he emphasizes that this is a righteous struggle, that this is a Christian struggle. Without love, for instance, he says, boycott is, quote, a meaningless drama. The boycott is a meaningless drama on the stage of history. These are powerful words. One theme that pops up again and again in King's writings is, and in his speeches, is the way that he fuses two American traditions, the ideals of American democracy and the biblical ideals or notions of Christian righteousness. Right? He's constantly pairing the two together. We'll see this again and again in King's writings and his speeches. It's at the center of who King is as a political figure in America in the 1950s and 1960s. Here's some quotes from that first speech. Right, this is the glory of America with all its faults. If we were incarcerated behind the iron curtains of a communistic nation, we couldn't do this. But the great glory of American democracy is the right to protest for right. In other words, he's saying we're real Americans, we're true Americans. Even though we're treated as second-class citizens, we are exercising our rights as Americans, right? And if you think about these sources of authority, right? If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of the nation is wrong. If we're wrong, the Constitution is wrong, right? These are traditions of American democracy. But if we're wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we're wrong, Jesus of Nazareth was merely a utopian dream, right? So he's fusing those ideals together. If we're wrong, justice is a lie. Bringing them together into one vision for where African Americans can go. So it launches the boycott. It's quite successful in that regard. It steals the Black community. The speech is a launching pad in a lot of ways for the boycott that continues. The original plan, as I mentioned, was just for a short-term boycott that wasn't designed to end segregation on Montgomery's buses, but because of the continued resistance of the white community in Memphis and the white power structure, the boycott continues for over a year. There's violence against King. His brother's house is bombed. He gets constantly harassed by the police. Other people in Black Montgomery face a very similar harassment. But it is the first example in a lot of ways of this national mass activism, of the power of nonviolent activism as a means of dramatizing Black second-class citizenship in Jim Crow America. Right? In an age of segregated public facilities, in an age where Black people are restricted from the vote, in an age where Black people's second-class status is still often enforced by violence. King also emerges out of the boycott as, in many ways, the premier spokesman for Black America. He's on the cover of Time magazine. He founds his own organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And yet, in the late 50s, even as the boycott is coming to its successful conclusion in 1956, with a Supreme Court ruling that the buses have to be desegregated, King is still sort of seeking his place in, he's still trying to figure out where to go from here, so to speak. As the boycott is ending, soon after that is the crisis in Little Rock, where there's with the integration of Central High School. But for the most part, civil rights is kind of almost like on the decline as a national political issue in the late 1950s. Black leaders are struggling to get the national attention and the attention of the Eisenhower administration and the mainstream media in the late 50s. There's many different boycotts, there's many different demonstrations, but they happen on a local scale. And while King's organization, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, continues in these years and launches voter registration drives, among other things, it's not really until 1960, when the student sit-in movement begins, that again you see this era of mass activism coalesce, and this time on a much larger scale. And it's important to realize that Martin Luther King did not launch the student sit-ins, of course. It starts with 4 African-American men, young men in Greensboro, North Carolina, at a Woolworths counter. They've read King's work. They've read Stride Toward Freedom, King's history of the Montgomery bus boycott. They've read different pamphlets on nonviolent activism. So they're inspired by King's work, but they do this on their own. And there's young students who are college-age students all around the country who are thinking about similar things, who launched their own sit-in movement in Nashville and Atlanta, all throughout the South. We see the formation of a new group, the Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which is kind of the militant vanguard of the movement. They don't fold into King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They go out on their own. So the second speech that I give you is in this context, is in 1960, in the midst of the student sit-in movement. And at this time, it's also an election year. It's 1960. And this is the year when John F. Kennedy is running against Richard Nixon, who Nixon has been Eisenhower's vice president. And as we'll see by the end of the election, civil rights becomes a key issue that helps in a few swing states, finally for JFK, because it's King, compelled by students in Atlanta, joins a sit-in, gets arrested, and stays in jail because of his high public prominence. And then ultimately JFK gives the call to Coretta Scott King. That helps to gets publicized in the Black community and helps to win in votes in states in the South, but also in places like Chicago, and helps to deliver states like Illinois. So it's bringing race into the public forum and into public politics in a new way. And King is part of this, right? He's a supporter of the sit-ins, but he's not the engine behind the sit-ins. So this second speech that I give you, called The Rising Tide of Racial Consciousness, this isn't as well known a speech of King's as some of the other ones that I've given. But I thought it was valuable for placing him in this particular moment of 1960. He's giving this speech to representatives of the Urban League. And so that's worth thinking about. The Urban League is an organization that dates back to the early 20th century. It's founded in the Progressive era, primarily African-American constituency within it. That is really rooted in the North and in trying to programs of economic uplift, essentially, is their goal. It's an organization that's typically quite cautious on civil rights. They look to white foundations, to liberal donors, to the federal government for funds and for support. Because they're dependent on white goodwill, they sort of tread cautiously in the arena of politics. So King is speaking to an audience here. Again, thinking about audience, this time, again, primarily African-American audience. And one that appreciates the civil rights struggle, certainly backs the core ideals of trying to have African-Americans achieve full democracy. But they might also be looking for connections to their own endeavors, to what's going on in the North, to make it real for them. And King, from his perspective, in terms of thinking about his agenda here, he wants their support. He wants a broader support for the Southern civil rights struggle, and in this case, through the sit-in. And so that's how he casts his message, right? He starts by basically explaining the sit-ins. Why is this happening? And he puts it in the language of sort of, at the beginning of sort of like a bird's eye view, macro analysis. He talks about the process of Black migration to the North, of education, of the Brown decision, of the worldwide movements against colonialism that are shaping the African-American struggle here at home, a new sort of Black self-image developing in the 50s, a new Black self-consciousness. And he also highlights white resistance to the civil rights movement, right? So this is something that his audience can relate to. This ideal of massive resistance is the idea of trying to combat integration, racial integration, wherever it might happen. And this is the dominant idea of many Southern white politicians. For instance, refusing to integrate your schools in the aftermath of the Brown decision is a good example of massive resistance. And again, speaking to his audience, he talks about sort of their common potential ally, the federal government, right? If the federal government speaks for American citizenship, or at least should in its ideal, right? He says, is talking in the context of the presidential election in 1960, it's noteworthy that both political parties have emerged with the strongest civil rights platforms in their history. They've signed huge promissory notes, but we must not be content with empty promises. And I'd actually to think about that phrase promissory notes, because we'll come back to it with the March on Washington speech, with the I Have a Dream speech in 1963. Maybe most noteworthy in terms of thinking about this speech is it gives us one of the earlier examples about how King is connecting the Southern civil rights struggle to the larger national picture. I want to highlight this quote in particular from the 1960 speech, right? Where he talks about liberalism, right? There's a pressing need for liberalism in the North, which is truly liberal, a liberalism that firmly believes in the integration in its own community as well as in the Deep South. In other words, don't just separate the Southern struggle from the rest of the country. There's the need for the type of liberal who not only rises up with righteous indignation when a Negro is lynched in Mississippi, but will be equally incensed when a Negro is denied the right to live in his neighborhood or join his professional association or secure a top position in his business. This is no day to pay mere lip service to integration. We must pay life service to it. So this is a message that's going to particularly resonate with the Black audience in the North, in particularly a group like the Urban League, which is fighting for just these kinds of struggles, right? But it also speaks to how King, even in these early years, is conscious of the civil rights struggle as extending beyond the South. We only apply it to him sometimes at the very end of his career, but it's a message throughout his life and career. All right, so in the intervening years, King is, again, he remains the preeminent Black spokesman. Wherever King goes, there's cameras and reporters and attention, but the civil rights struggle is wide-ranging. The Freedom Rides of 1961, again, initiated by young activists in CORE and then later in SNCC. The Ole Miss crisis in 1962 is initiated by one single man, James Meredith, who ends up bringing up this, forcing the federal government to intervene to protect his right to go to the University of Mississippi amidst much violence. King is searching for his own, he's still struggling to find his way in a lot of ways. He leads a campaign in Southwest Georgia in a city called Albany that fails in many ways, in which his tactics of nonviolence, the sheriff in Albany, Laurie Pritchett, is good at sort of quelling them. He doesn't engage in public violence because he knows that's what nonviolence depends upon. But there's certainly a momentum shift in 1963. In that spring is when the demonstrations begin in Birmingham, Alabama. And King in many ways has learned his lessons from Albany. He's planned, he's got a lot of resources available. He's done nonviolent workshops with a huge number of people within Birmingham. He's raised a lot of money, and they have a specific target in terms of downtown department stores. And that's where it begins. He's arrested. They also target Birmingham because of its notorious Commissioner of Public Safety, a guy named Bull Connor, who uses violence against Black demonstrators. King is arrested in the midst of this. He writes his famous letter from Birmingham jail that you probably know, that is maybe the most complete, succinct, beautiful expression of King's ideals that you might find, in which he rejects the idea of waiting and speaks about the higher moral law that is necessary. And he speaks about the power of nonviolent action again, and how it doesn't cause racial tension, but it simply brings it to the surface. And in that way, it's quite active in forcing these confrontations. When King emerges from jail, that's when you see the beginnings of the Children's Crusade, in which they recruit what begins as high school age children, but even younger children who join into the civil rights demonstrations, are arrested en masse. And this becomes national news. And Bull Connor's forces increasingly resort to violence, including fire hoses on demonstrators, including using attack dogs. And this is the kind of these images and these ideas are being transmitted through the news, both through newspapers and through the television news, horrifying much of the nation. It's dramatizing Southern racism, just as King had envisioned the power of nonviolent direct action. And John F. Kennedy, who'd been very reluctant to sponsor a civil rights bill in the aftermath of the Birmingham demonstrations, calls civil rights, quote, a moral issue, as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. You see where he goes to for authority, right? Just he adopts King's language of fusing Christian righteousness and American democracy. So to understand the famous "I Have a Dream" speech in March on Washington, right, and the March on Washington, it's important to put it into this context, right? In the aftermath of Birmingham, it's at the very end of August 28 of 1963. There are nationwide demonstrations in the aftermath of Birmingham. 70,000 people participate at least. In the March on Washington, 250,000 people arrive. This is the brainchild originally of a socialist activist named A. Philip Randolph, a labor leader. But it becomes co-opted in some ways into this, and originally it began as a sort of march for jobs. In some ways it gets co-opted and becomes more of a political message to pass a civil rights bill. I mentioned 250,000 people, roughly 20% of those people are white. So it's attracting a more interracial audience. There are speeches not just by the Black leaders of major civil rights organizations, but also religious leaders, including white religious leaders, a rabbi, a union leader, and Walter Reuther. Performances by celebrities like Joan Baez and Peter, Paul and Mary, Bob Dylan. And so it's cast in some of the ways as sort of this ideal of interracial cooperation and democracy, of a very liberal message in that sense. And within that it's important to recognize that this roils a lot of Black activists, particularly those who have sort of been in the meat of the civil rights struggle and have suffered violence and have become frustrated with unreliable white liberals in their right. The federal government has not been particularly supportive of them. Some white liberals might donate some money, but they don't put themselves on the line in the same way. James Farmer, who's the head of CORE, is in a jail in Louisiana, and he refuses to be bailed out to go to the March on Washington. He says that this is the message is too moderated on the march, that we're not really genuinely expressing Black discontent. And very famously, John Lewis, who at this time is the head of SNCC, had planned to give a speech that was quite fiery and had some language in it that included that we were going to march through the heart of Dixie the way Sherman did and burn Jim Crow to the ground, sort of the language of the Civil War, which would really incense a lot of white Southerners. And the other civil rights leaders and a bunch of march leaders plead with Lewis to change the language, and they force this sort of last-minute shifts in his speech, much to his frustration. Even Malcolm X goes to basically check out the March on Washington. He later calls it the farce on Washington. Basically, he's a critic of that the white people are part of the march, that it's designed simply to make white liberals feel better and to allay their guilt, that there's a lack of engagement with the bigger issues that face African Americans, including economic issues that plague people around the country, not just those in the South. And he sort of mocks the idea of nonviolent revolution. Whoever heard of angry revolutionists swinging their bare feet together with their oppressor in lily pad park pools with gospels and guitars and "I Have a Dream" speeches? So it's important to recognize, again, in the ways that we think of King's speech as a classic of American oratory and as this resonant moment. And it was all those things, but it also attracted, the march and the speech itself also attracted critics within Black America, and that's key to recognize. So, thinking about the famous speech, King's speech from '63, right? I think it's important to do three things with it. One is to cast it within this moment of 1963, right? This shifting, tumultuous year in the civil rights struggle. Second is to think of it as a political document. In what ways is it casting for more public support so that Congress will pass a civil rights bill, which it ultimately will do in 1964, the famous Civil Rights Bill 64 that ultimately leads to the end of legalized Jim Crow in the South over the next decade. And it's also important, connected to this, is to understand the way that King casts language to different audiences, right? He's got to, in this case, he's got a massive television audience as well as an audience there. He's got to reach the Black political spectrum, right? From radical to liberal to conservative. And he's got to reach a broader white America, so to speak, to gain their political support. So that's all going on at the same time in the midst of this speech. So remember that idea of the promissory note, right? That's part of how he begins his speech. He uses this metaphor of cashing a check for democracy, a check that's long been marked with insufficient funds. And there's a very, if you start from the beginning of the speech, and of course, you can find it, footage of it easily on the internet. You know that he starts with this very steady cadence, very measured. He's reading his speech. This is his prepared remarks. And we see how he makes the analogies to the 100 years ago, the Emancipation Proclamation. Of course, he's in the shadow of Abraham Lincoln. So there's a strong resonance there that we need to realize the promise of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now here we are 1 century later. And you can see how he says 100 years later, the Negro still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here to dramatize the shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. Right? So again, that metaphor comes into play. And we can see within it, he's in some ways quite explicit about how he's sending a message both to white America and to Black America, right? To white Americans, he's saying, look, don't think of this as something that you can just sort of, oh, you supported the March on Washington and you can just sort of go home now. He's explicitly says 1963 is a beginning, not an ending. And if you think that we're just going to return to the status quo, business as usual, you're in for, quote, a rude awakening. But he also speaks to Black Americans. He's counteracting that bitterness, that militancy, the radicalism of Malcolm X by celebrating his white allies who are here, by saying we need white liberal support, and that we can't, in sort of an implicit repudiation of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. He says we cannot satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. So he's, explicit or implicit, I should say, about where he's casting himself within Black politics here. In different fragments of the speech, also, again, he's thinking about different audiences, about who to reach. We tend to think of King focusing on issues of economic justice at the end of his political career in the late 60s. But it's here in the March speech too. It's here in the I Have a Dream speech, right? He talks about issues of economic justice. He talks about issues of systemic racism. We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality, right? An issue that was, again, at the forefront in 2020. There's one particular line from King's speech that many conservatives today often cite to say, we're living in King's dream, right? And that's this idea that I have a dream one day that my 4 little children will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And the classic conservative formulation, right? We should be judged as individuals without special privileges to any group. And so this becomes that language. And certainly King, I don't think he would ever have cast himself as a conservative. That's somewhat laughable. But it does speak to how within the March on Washington's, within the I Have a Dream speeches messages, right? He hits on different points to reach different people's conceptions of what's right. And you can think about a message of economic justice and systemic racism as particularly resonating with Black urban audiences beyond the South, right? People who King sees as part of his larger coalition, people who he sees as necessary to be part of the struggle. Here I've just tried to highlight some of the different language tools that he uses, some of the ideas that he uses. One is this idea of metaphor. I have a couple examples here, right? In the first quote where he's using the language of the desert, right? The state sweltering with the heat of injustice, but will transform into an oasis of freedom and justice. And in the other one, a more musical metaphor. With this faith, we'll be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. So here we just see a talent in terms of King's oratory, again, rooted in the Black church of using these sort of metaphorical constructions. Second idea is the way that he urges his audience to empathize, to think about other people's struggles, and to particularly do this through children, right? Because children have this power. So that's another way of thinking about that famous line about the content of the color of their skin and the content of their character. He says that my 4 little children. Children are innocent. Children don't deserve to be oppressed, right? Putting it in those terms, and you can see it again in this contrast in the second quote there on empathy between the vicious racists with their words dripping with evil words of interposition and nullification, and contrasting that with little Black boys and Black girls who'll be able to join hands with white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers, right? That's his dream. And finally, the speech is awash in biblical imagery, in language that doesn't necessarily directly quote from the Bible, but uses the same ideas, uses many of the same resonances and symbols that you'd find in the Bible. That every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the tough places will be made plain, the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. That's the language that resonates from the biblical tradition, and certainly within the Black pulpit. And the famous line about, this is our hope, this is the faith that I go to the south with. With this faith, we'll be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. Again, that's mountains and stones are constant imagery within the Bible. So these are just some of the techniques that King highlights, or that King uses within the I Have a Dream speech. And at the very end, it's worth thinking about that longer King's oratorical tradition of fusing American democracy and Christian righteousness. This is the very end of the speech, of course, and he even quotes from America, right? From we'll be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, 'tis of thee," and this idea of "let freedom ring," right? Speaks to sort of there's patriotic overtones to it. And at the very end of it, right, when all of God's children, Black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing, right? That's a very inclusive, interracial message, right? But he ends with the idea of the Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last, bringing it back to the Black church, right? As a way of implicitly including African Americans in the democratic tradition in this very focused way in the midst of this march. So these are just some of the key ideas within the speech in the March on Washington that are worth considering. I gave you two more speeches from near the end of King's life that come after this crossroads, so to speak, of the mid-1960s, right? In this period, from say 63 to about 67, right? You could argue that this is the most progress that African Americans have achieved since 1863 to 1867, when slavery was destroyed, right? You have the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. You have increasing growth of the African American middle class, given more economic opportunities in the midst of this economic prosperity. You have Black mayors in cities like Gary, Indiana, and Detroit. You have Thurgood Marshall being appointed to the Supreme Court in 1967. There's other examples that we can point to in this regard. But for many Black Americans, these are also years of great frustration, with the idea that the status quo for them, their lives haven't really changed despite the sort of great American promise. The United States has put forth the idea that we can achieve economic prosperity and we can fight communism and we can bring more democratic rights to more Americans. But for life on the ground for many African Americans, it hasn't changed at all. The idea of Black Power, the slogan of Black Power, arises in 1966 on a march through Mississippi called the Meredith March. Black Power is in many ways an implicit criticism of King's ideals of nonviolence and racial brotherhood. Black Power believes that for African Americans to achieve political power, they have to coalesce into one unified group and build their own strength. And that can work in economic terms as well. King brings his techniques of the Southern Civil Rights Campaign to the North, to Chicago in 65 and 66. But to much less success. He leaves with sort of a weak settlement, and because there's already sort of a whole network of Black political power brokers in Chicago. And then particularly, we see it in South Central Los Angeles in 1965 and elsewhere in 66, but in 1967, that's the year of great urban violence in African-American communities and particularly cities, destroying the city within through riots, attacking symbols of white authority, including the police and white-owned businesses. There's the famous Kerner Commission, a government-appointed commission in 1968 that says that investigates these riots and says we're increasingly seeing two societies, one white, one Black, unequal. So this is the context in which King is trying to sort of adjust his message and trying to think about, where do we go from here, to use a line of King's. One way, as we see for King, is to criticize America's involvement in the Vietnam War. The escalation of American troops begins in 1965, but it truly intensifies in 66, 67, 68. By 1968, there's 500,000 US troops in Vietnam. King is a critic of US escalation of troops from 1965. Part of his criticism is that the Vietnam War is siphoning funds away from government programs, away from Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs that are fighting poverty, for instance, and trying to revamp America's cities. By 1967, it cost $24 billion a year to maintain these troops. King later says, in a real sense, the Great Society has been shot down on the battlefields of Vietnam. But he's doing so when he gets a question at a press conference, when he gets a question on Face the Nation, and his unsteady alliance with Lyndon Johnson is certainly fraying by 1966, early 67. But he doesn't come out with sort of an outright statement against Vietnam until this famous speech at Riverside Church in New York City in the spring of 1967. And as a background for that, it's important to recognize that King was very much affected by an article in Ramparts magazine, which was a radical magazine of the time, published on the West Coast. It showed a picture of Vietnamese children and the injuries and burns they suffered from napalm as a result of the war itself. And King couldn't get these images out of his head, and it's what sort of finally drove him to think about acting. And so by early 1967, he's doing appearances with anti-war activists, and he participates in an anti-war march in Chicago. But then he feels like he finally has to make his own statement. And that's when he gives this famous speech known as Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. And in it, he says, a time comes when silence is betrayal, right? When if he doesn't speak out, he feels like he is betraying his own conscience. Oops, I went the wrong way. King knows, again, thinking about the audience this time, he's reaching a big national audience. Riverside Church is a white church, one that has been historically supportive of the Black freedom movement, one that has a liberal tradition. It has a lot of wealthy parishioners, and it's a huge church. So it's kind of influential within the tumult of the 1960s. King knows that he is going to be subject to criticism for giving the speech, right? Why? Because people say, you're a civil rights leader, stay out of foreign policy. And that's central to his message here, right? He's constantly trying to counteract the idea that he's stepping out of his lane, right? He says explicitly, I believe that the path from Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, the church in Montgomery, Alabama, where I began my pastorate, leads clearly to this sanctuary tonight. And the reason why he's speaking out, he lays it out, right? That we have sort of national priorities, that we're not fighting poverty if we're fighting a war, that as someone who advocates nonviolence, he can't support in any way support this war, and that the role of the minister, the role of the clergyman, is to speak on issues of social conscience, right? If you're not doing that, then if you're upholding the power structure of those who oppress people, you're not serving your people. And very powerfully, he calls for what we might call a revolution of values, to use his term. I'm convinced that if we're to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. And he identifies in his rhetoric 3 evils of American society: racism, which is of course combated his entire career; militarism, which goes against the spirit of nonviolence and was manifested in the Vietnam War; but also materialism, but the United States. So he becomes increasingly a critic of capitalism and the acquisitive spirit that it engenders over the course of the 1960s. For instance, in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here?, he'll say that we need to have an annual guaranteed income for all Americans, for instance. But more than that, we need to sort of change the way that the core values of who we are as Americans. It's that very idea that leads him to create what he calls the Poor People's Campaign. This idea is that in the summer of 1968, he's going to create this huge coalition, not just of African Americans, but of poor whites and Latinos and American Indians, and bring them to Washington, D.C., and to lobby to launch this mass demonstration and this encampment on the Washington Mall that will lobby Congress to truly fight poverty, to create kind of like a Marshall Plan to fight poverty in America. And it's within the planning for the Poor People's Campaign that he's invited to come to Memphis, Tennessee, to my hometown, in the midst of a strike by sanitation workers in the winter of 1968. And just as a brief context for the speech, the photo that you see here is of King leading a march in late March down Beale Street in Memphis that descends into violence. There's some Black youth at the tail end of the march who are smashing windows, and then the police come in and basically attack the marchers, and King is sort of hustled off to his hotel room. And it's the first time that one of King's nonviolence demonstrations within the march itself, people engage in violence. And it devastates King, and he resolves that he's going to come back to Memphis to lead a nonviolent march. And that's what brings him back on April 3rd of 1968. But he's exhausted at this point. He's going through a period of sort of deep gloom, and he doesn't want, and he's not planning to speak at Mason Temple, the big church, one of the big churches in Memphis, where there's a mass meeting that night. Ralph Abernathy, basically his second in command, is the one who's designed to give the speech. But when he gets there, and there's a huge rainstorm too, so they don't think a lot of people are going to come. When Abernathy gets there, there's 1,200 people there. They've packed into this huge temple, and he calls King and says, "You need to get over here from the Lorraine Motel." And that's when King somewhat extemporaneously gives his speech known as "I See the Promised Land." And this is a speech that I would urge you, if you have the time and you have the inclination, to go back and watch from beginning to end. I would argue that it's probably his most powerful speech that he's ever given. And it's often referred to as "I See the Promised Land," from a line from it. In it, he calls for what he calls a dangerous unselfishness among activists, that we need to change who we are. He invokes the larger tradition of nonviolent struggle in Birmingham and Selma and other places. And he says the Memphis protests can follow in that tradition. But within this, there's also some very explicit calls for economic justice and for activism to bring that about, to boycott companies that discriminate against African Americans, to invest in Black-owned businesses and Black-owned banks. And this is when he calls for this idea of a dangerous unselfishness. And within this, he uses the parallel of the Good Samaritan, that, you know, who would I be if I didn't stop and help this person? Right? And within the speech also, there's this sense of his own martyrdom. At the very end, he gets exceptionally emotional and speaks to this idea. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I'd like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. So once again, we see him adapting the language of the pulpit, of the traditions of the Black church, into his larger message, into his vision of justice. And of course, the next day, April 4th, 1968, he's back at the Lorraine Motel, and he's assassinated, right? And with that comes an end to King's life, and in many ways, an end to a political era, because of what King symbolized, because of what King meant. And for many people, this is the death of nonviolence. And obviously, of course, the Mason Temple speech was his final speech. Before I get to the resources, I just wrote down some questions to consider that in some ways they harken back to the questions that we started with. And, you know, as teachers, I don't know exactly how you would use it. You're the best judges of your classroom, certainly much more experience with teaching that age than I do. But I don't know if these work as discussion questions, as essay questions, as larger things to frame around. And you can figure out what works for you and what doesn't work for you. But I just sort of tried to throw out some questions that interest me that I hope can maybe stimulate something for you. So one is just going back to this idea that we were talking about before. How does King fuse ideas of American democracy and Christian faith? But why does he pursue this strategy as well? And that's something that maybe you can get your students to think about, to get underneath that. What are his goals? Why would that resonate with his particular audiences? And how might it change in terms of how he's using that language, for instance, in 1955, then in 1963? Another thing to do is maybe if you took all these speeches and to think about what unites them, right? In what ways are the languages and the values consistent, and what's different about them? You know, how is he responding to new circumstances? I wrote down a bunch of questions for the March on Washington, or for the I Have a Dream speech, excuse me, because I know that that's something that your guidelines as teachers urges you to work with. And so these are just, you know, context setting questions, but also thinking about what King's goals are, particularly at that moment in 1963, and particularly thinking about the Civil Rights Bill. Placing King in dialogue with other African-American leaders, both those who are at the March on Washington and those who are critics of the March on Washington, and maybe how King is sort of at the center of that. And then thinking about the speech itself, why begin with that metaphor, the idea of the promissory note of cashing the check? How is he thinking about different audiences? And then thinking in particular about, you know, we all celebrate the I Have a Dream section, but thinking more about why we celebrate it, and what it might say about the Black contribution to American ideals, to American culture. The I Have a Dream speech can give us one way into that, I think. if you want to think more about King at the end, right, in 67, 68, you pair together these last two speeches. But they're not the last two speeches he ever, actually, the Promised Land is the last speech he ever gives. Beyond the Vietnam is the year before. But they might give us a way to think about King's shifting priorities in this time, how he's responding to new circumstances, but also what is King seeing about America, right? This idea of a revolution of values is really powerful. It might really stimulate your students to think about who Martin Luther King was and how he thought about America at this time. There's a famous question that sort of riffs on a quote from Ella Baker. Ella Baker was once a member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Then she urged the young activists in SNCC to form their own organization. So in some ways, she was a critic of SCLC too, particularly as a woman who felt like she was shortchanged within this male-dominated organization, but also because of her ideas of sort of grassroots. What really drives change is grassroots organization. And so she said, it wasn't so much that Martin made the movement as the movement made Martin. And that's something worth, so shifting that into question, it's a way of asking essentially, what was King's larger role within the civil rights movement? He wasn't the civil rights movement after all, right? If you think about the student sit-ins, for instance, and how they initiated this new era of activism, King is responding to the students. The students aren't responding to King. And coming back to that question that I started at the beginning, was King a liberal or a radical? I don't think there's an easy answer to this question, but if we define liberal and define radical and then try to figure out where does King fit in within that, that could stimulate some interesting debate or maybe an interesting essay for your students. And then finally, just thinking about some resources. Someone asked about a reading list. These are obviously Martin Luther King has inspired more scholarly literature than any other figure within the Black freedom struggle for understandable reasons. The standard or the most significant one-volume biography is a book by David Garrow called Bearing the Cross. It's a big one. It's maybe 600 pages long. And it's a cradle to grave story. It's very well done. It's the first to really use all the FBI sources and all the FBI surveillance of King. And it's a very beautifully told story. A book that I find very interesting is a book that focuses on King's focus on economic justice by the historian Michael Honey. It's called To the Promised Land. And there's a famous book by the theologian, African-American theologian James Cone, called Martin and Malcolm in America, A Dream or a Nightmare. This is an older book. I think it's from the early 70s even, if I'm not mistaken. But it is a sort of a theological and political historical analysis of the two leaders as a pair from again, someone who was active in Black theology and the civil rights struggle in that very same time period. It almost serves as a primary source in some ways. And then some other useful books. A book that I use in the class that I teach on the civil rights movement is a book called Voices of Freedom, that book in the middle. It is rooted in the Eyes on the Prize documentary film series. It takes those same interviews as text and it turns them into a story. So the voices in it are the voices of people within the civil rights struggle. And what I really like about it is that students connect to it because they see the people and that they see different kinds of people. There's a lot of sort of people in local communities. When it's talking about the civil rights struggle in Albany, Georgia, where King is at, it doesn't just focus on Martin Luther King. It talks about the local leaders and about the plight of local people. And it also interviews government officials and white Southerners and everybody in between. So it's this great collection of voices. This edited collection, Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, is also a really good classroom tool. I've only seen it as a very expensive book, unfortunately. So I don't know if it's useful in that sense, but what it does is it pairs together essays in debate. So Martin Luther King and gender, ideas of manhood and womanhood, Martin Luther King and the uses of nonviolence, Martin Luther King's theological ideas. So there's a pair of sort of interpretive essays that go on each of these big themes. So if you really want to go more in depth on King, that might be a good book. And then if you're in particular interested in I Have a Dream speech and want to create more context for it, I like the book by William Jones called The March on Washington, Jobs, Freedom, and the Forgotten History of Civil Rights, which puts the March on Washington itself into a longer history of the fight for economic justice. So these are just some books that are useful. I mentioned also this, just for the collection of speeches, if you want to look at other speeches, this I Have a Dream, Writings and Speeches That Change the World is just a collection of King's speeches that I find to be really a good handy resource. That's how I started this talk, when I first started reading it again. And then finally, there's this multimedia project created by Stanford University. Stanford University houses the Martin Luther King papers, and they have a project within it called Freedom's Ring. which is a multimedia exploration of the March on Washington. Let's see if it pops up. Here it is. It's the length of King's speech, but it's done sort of as an illustrated history. I'll just play a little bit of it for you so you get a sense of it if we can. And it goes on from there. I'd urge you to check it out. It's really beautiful the way it's done. And it's a really neat resource.